Okay, welcome back to the last set. There's actually going to be two recordings for today because I want to make sure I don't go over the 15 minutes that I have in each video. It shouldn't be. There might be 10 minutes for each video or something like that. So there'll be two of them. So this is part 4A. So let's get on to where we left off. If you remember, we stopped with the Constitution actually being written. We talked about some of the things about it. So we have to go on to the next step. It's just been written now. So the next thing we have to do is ratify it. The Constitution has to be approved to go into effect. So that's all laid out in Article 7. Article 7 is very short, and of course it's only used one time because that's how you ratify the document. And if you look in there, it says number 1, it takes 9 state conventions to approve of the Constitution, then it would go into effect. Now, state conventions you see is bolded there, and that's because in a couple of slides we'll talk about it again. So I just want to make sure you have that in your mind. And so once 9 states approve of it, then it goes into effect for those 9 states only. Obviously, it wouldn't go into effect for somebody who had not approved of it yet. So there's going to be a fight about this because there is a significant portion of the population and a significant portion of some of the politicians that are not in favor of the Constitution. So this is going to be fought in every state. It's going to be at a state by state, 13 different battles to approve of this particular document. So let's see who's for it and who's against it. So the supporters, we call them Federalists, and they are going to be the large landowners, the professionals, the wealthy merchants, and we have to understand why. And the reason why is, number 1, those are the kind of people who wrote it, and they wrote it to get a stronger national government. So we want to make sure that's what they wanted to do. So it's going to have weaker state governments. It's going to be government by the elite, less concern for individual rights. And what that means is not necessarily that they didn't care about them, but as we talked about last time, it means that they didn't see the need to put stuff into the Constitution since it was already guaranteed at the state level and things like that. And again, it's going to favor their own interests because strong national government does favor the more elite part of the population. So we've got the other side of it, the anti-federalists. And one of the things we have to keep in mind, it's 2020, Constitution's been in effect for over 230 years. So we use it, it's there. So if we think back and go, why would people be against it? Well, we have to understand that they are not unpatriotic, they are not un-American. They were sincerely believing that this new government was going to be an enemy to freedom. It was going to be too strong. And as you read in the Brutus I portion of the Federalist 10 Brutus I assignment, you can see that Brutus I lays out his arguments saying that the national government, with the way you gave it power, is going to be too big and too strong. And we had just gotten away from something like that. So it was a sincerely held belief by a large number of people in the new states. They said it was a class-based document. They said it erodes fundamental liberties. So let's see who they were. So they're essentially the opposite of who the Federalists were. The small farmers, the shopkeepers, the laborers, people like that. So you can put them on opposite sides. It's the smaller group. It's probably a majority, and when you put everything together, it might even be a majority of the citizens that are actually against it. But what do they favor? Of course, the stronger state government. They like what the Articles of Confederation had as far as the power distribution goes. And they wanted strengthened individual liberties, and we're going to see that that is going to be the argument that helps them the most. So, again, it's going to be a state-by-state debate. It's going to take place in really the only means of communication there is, in the newspapers. So it's going to be editorials for and against. They're going to compete with each other to try to convince people that this is a good thing or a bad thing. And when we've done a couple of them already, we've done Federalist 10, we've done Federalist 51. The Federalist 51 will be part of your assignment today. The Federalist Papers were part of the battle in New York. It was specifically related to the fight, which was an uphill fight in New York. And the authors are going to be James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. They all use pseudonyms, and when you see the Federalist 51, you'll see the signed name is Publius, and that's Madison's name. And they used these pseudonyms just, it was the way things were written back then. Brutus I was a pseudonym. and so on. So again, they're going to fight this battle. It's in New York. New York is not going to approve of this right away, and it's going to take a good way to convince people that this is what they want. However, what they are for us is an excellent insight into the way the framers characterized the government. It's still used today. The court system uses them. What did the framers really mean by this particular thing? And a lot of that information can be found in the Federalist Papers, because it's a great way to look at how they thought the government would work under the Constitution. Okay, so the Anti-Federalists on the other side, they're going to be just as hardworking, just as adamant that their side is right, and their arguments are actually all collected now in what's called the Anti-Federalist Papers. And it's a good collection of those writings that say this government was going to be too strong. So what really wins the day for them, and this is what they managed to get out of this battle, was the idea that the individual liberties is necessary. They have to be written down. And they win that argument. They forced the Federalists to promise to add amendments as soon as they could to protect individual liberties. And they weren't going to go back and write a new document, but the promise by the Federalists for most of the states that were holdouts was enough. And interestingly enough, politicians, they really did that. They followed through on their promise as soon as they could. One of the very first things that they did was start to put together these amendments for individual liberties, and that becomes the first 10 amendments. That becomes the Bill of Rights, which we'll look at a lot more in depth when we do Unit 3. So the Federalists, again, are not going to be in the majority, and most state legislatures are not going to be happy with the document, and hopefully you can see why. The reason is that it takes away state power. So if you're in a state government, if you're a legislator in a state government, you are not going to really want your power taken away, because human beings, it's human nature. That was part of what Federalist 10 is. It's part of what Federalist 51 is, talking about human nature. And they're not going to give up power readily. Article 7 says, and this is where a couple slides ago, state conventions was bolded, and it's bolded here because that's why they chose this method. They said state conventions because they knew the legislatures were going to be less positive about this new development, so they decided they wanted conventions in the states instead, and that was going to work well for them. These guys are pretty darn smart. Okay, so then the last slide, I think, for this segment, yes, the first 5 states are gonna fall in line really quickly. They're the smaller states. They quickly approve. An answer to a trivia question is always Delaware first, and the reason why is that they liked that equal representation in the Senate, and they didn't think they could do any better than that. So they were on board. They thought that this was the best deal they were going to get, and they took it. Georgia is one of those first 5 states. And again, smaller states in population. And by June, we roll around into June 1788, the 9th state, New Hampshire, ratifies it, and the Constitution is in effect. But the idea here is, does it matter? Yes, there's 9 states, but here's the issue. That still leaves the 2 largest states, Virginia and North Carolina. I'm sorry, Virginia and New York are the largest states by population, and then of course you got the other 2 states that haven't approved it yet either. And Virginia and New York, they're the largest ones. The country is not going to work if the 2 largest states are not part of this new governing system. So yes, it was in effect for the 9 states, but it really didn't quite matter yet. They finally ratified after getting those promises those verbal promises for adding a Bill of Rights or some amendments about individual rights. That left North Carolina and Rhode Island. North Carolina essentially wanted it in writing, basically. They wanted a further assurance, and they secured the promise of a Bill of Rights, and they finally approved. And Rhode Island actually held out until the amendments were actually added. So the first government set up was only with 12 states. Once the Bill of Rights was added a year and a half or so later, then Rhode Island ended up joining and approving of it. So they held out until the amendments were actually approved of and ratified and as part of the Constitution. So the Constitution is now in effect. The states have ratified it, And in 1788, we're going to have elections. They're going to be held in November, and the new government's going to establish and going to be started in 1789. All right, that's it for this set. Remember, there's a part 2, and that'll be up. So I will see you again shortly.